So we're in the federal realm,
Yep.
and one of the big issues out there has been whether or not there's going to be a federal breach notice law that preempts all the state laws. Industry has wanted that. Consumer groups arguably want a federal law to give it more authority, breach notice more authority. And we've got a few bills winding their way through Congress. The one that's gotten the furthest is called the Data Accountability and Trust Act. It was passed in the House in December of 2009. And while this may not be the final law, I just want to give you a taste of the approach that they're using so you can compare and contrast against state breach notice laws. First off, preemption. So it, in theory, would preempt all state laws. Now, this bill only applies to organizations that are subject to FTC jurisdiction. So I think the financial industry and insurance industry may not be subject to this particular law, but there are other laws in the Senate that have a wider jurisdiction. What it does, basically a lot of it is very similar to state laws in terms of the definition of PII. There is a risk of harm threshold that must be met. If there's no reasonable risk of identity theft, there's no need to report. So that's one big difference against some state laws that don't have a risk of harm threshold, where if there's just unauthorized access or reasonably believed unauthorized access to personal information, there may be a reporting obligation. Under federal law, there is a higher threshold. So there may be less reporting relative to those low threshold states than currently exists. The big change in this particular law, though, right now for breach notice law, one of the big expenses is you're required to mail out notices to all the people, and that adds up. It's a multiplier expense. If you have 10,000, 100,000, a million people that are breached, that's a million notices that go out, and that cost adds up fairly quickly, and it's one of the costs that's now covered by insurance. Under this particular law, you'd also have to set up a call center for the individuals, as well as credit monitoring for the individuals. So those two components are sometimes set up voluntarily by organizations to help their consumer base or their employee base, but this would actually mandate it under the law. And again, that's the multiplier effect there. Credit monitoring can cost anywhere from $10 a year per person to $250 a year per person, multiplied by 10,000, a million, 10 million, whatever records it may be. So if this law is passed as is, it will be a lot more expensive if there's a security breach. So now what would this law mean if it were passed? I think actually, ironically, it may result in less notice because of what happens now with state laws. If you have a database with all 50 state residents in it, you basically say, well, if I have to provide notice in California, even though New Jersey's standard is higher, they have a harm threshold, I'm just going to provide notice to everyone. Now you have a situation where if it happened in California and this federal law preempted California and the identity theft risk of harm threshold was there, you may not be giving notice to those California residents under the federal law. Or you may not be giving notice across the entire spectrum of states. The second thing is if you truly are having to make credit monitoring, call centers, and mailing costs, there's going to be a high incentive to try to avoid having to provide notice because those costs are going to add up very quickly. So ironically, on that end of the equation, there may be less reporting under the federal law. On the flip side of that, however, the federal law, the Data Accountability Act, has civil penalties of up to $11,000 per violation. And the bill specifically says that each failure to provide notice to an individual or provision of improper notice to an individual can be considered a violation, up to $11,000. So on the fine and penalty side of the equation, you have kind of a multiplier effect, which may which may cause people to take it very seriously and provide notice because they want to avoid the fines and penalties. So it's hard to say where this is going to end up. Similar to the PCI laws, I think there are lobbyists on both sides of the aisle, consumer-friendly and industry-friendly, who are kind of going head-to-head here, and I highly doubt that this particular version of the law will pass. But there's something out there, and if something like this does pass, again, I think it changes the game as far as risk. The Bowsher bill, again, this is a privacy-oriented law, and it's very broad, and actually the congressman who put it forth said it was just a discussion draft bill. But basically, it requires notice and consent for any kind of collection of personal information prior to the collection of personal information, and it requires actual specific opt-in consent if you're going to disclose or share the information with non-affiliates. Now, again, most organizations now that handle personal information have privacy policies. They're not necessarily required in every state by law. This would require a privacy policy. It would require that you get this consent prior to the actual collection or use of information, and could impose, again, kind of much more onerous obligations on organizations that deal with information, which at this point in time is almost every organization out there, especially those online.